We talk about reshoring and onshoring in a very near-term lens of are we bringing back trade? But at the end of the day, this has been a long-term pattern of concerted effort to try and bring more production back into the United States. And a big piece of that is, having the available resources.
I thought you were...
No, we haven't dropped the T word yet.
We'll tee it up.
Yeah. Well, yeah, boom.
Welcome to Money Market, a Bank of Tampa podcast. We highlight the businesses, expert business advice, the local economy, and points of interest in the Tampa Bay market. Follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. To make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and share this episode with a friend or colleague. I am your host, Owen Lefebvre, the Pinellas County Market President for the Bank of Tampa, Tampa Bay's oldest and largest community bank. Today, we're going to geek out a little bit. We are joined by Patrick Luce and Jeremy Bess, both senior economists at Stantec, which for those that don't know, it's an international professional consulting services company, planning, engineering, architecture, project management, project economics. Did I cover it?
That's the list.
Filling out all the boxes.
Good. I know there's a couple more boxes in there, but we could keep going.
That's the list.
Yeah.
No, I am excited. I think people know one of my monikers on LinkedIn. I am a banker. I do very much as a result of that. Deal with a lot of business owners, follow the economy. It's something that I am very much a fan of macro economics, and kind of ties in directly to you. And I think a lot of what you and your background can bring to our listening audience, which again, a lot of business owners, a lot of professionals in the community, is what the heck is going on with the economy? Because it seems economics is always boring, right? There was never, it was just kind of stagnant. Yeah, things change every 5 to 10 years. But it seems like we have been in this period of time, and I don't know if we're at the end of a 100-year cycle, but like, what's going on? Let's start with the volatility.
Yeah, I think we can start off with it is incredibly volatile. We've been dealing with probably, we could say the COVID period probably set off what everyone thinks is volatile, but at the end of the day, like, we know the economy goes through fluctuations, ups and downs. I think what's happened is over the last couple decades, we've had multiple big events that have kind of shook us. But at the end of the day, sure, we're talking about a lot of different volatilities.
So big events at greater frequency, right? Or am I just imagining that?
Well, I think, again, you have what we think of business cycles, ebbs and flows of things, contractions. That happens every few years. But sure, right? You think of the Great Recession, you think of the pandemic period. But at the end of the day, you go, oh, wait, the time before that was... right, the early 2000s, that was very impactful, right? If you think about what it did to equities specifically, very big,
yes.
Right? You go back into the early 90s, you have something also similar. So we have these events. I think maybe we're maybe clinging on to what's been going on. I've actually liked to consider what's been going on since probably 2022. Everyone almost wants a recession. I don't know why, but it has been talked about
We've
for
been calling
3
for it.
years.
Right.
Been calling for it for 3 years. I'm going, oh my gosh. So, right, there's volatility around sentiment. But I think throughout probably today's presentation, we'll probably have a little bit of a, I want to say, rosier picture of what's going on in the economic world. But I think if we look back just at the last couple of years, it actually hasn't been that bad, specifically in the U.S., right?
Jeremy, if you're going to get rosy, it's going to tank our ratings.
Yeah.
Everybody wants the doom.
Recession.
So again, we say recession enough times. We've been calling it, economists as a group, been calling it for the past 3 years, and it just quite hasn't come yet. And I think a lot of it is there's so much noise. And how do you pierce through the noise? And that's what we try to do. We focus on the data, especially the hard data, and what it's telling us. There are a lot of mixed signals right now as we peek out into the future, the remainder of 2025, heading into 2026. I know sentiment's pretty darn weak right now, whether you're talking about the consumer or businesses, but let's focus on also the positives. What's going on with the health of the consumer right now as we think about things like debt to income ratios, what's going on with real wage growth, what's going on with businesses and their corporate profits. And so there is a lot of mixed signals. We don't want to be those one-hand economists and other-hand economists, but we do need to kind of sift through a lot of that noise to focus on the data.
But let's jump into the consumer, right?
Okay.
Because consumer, we pulled back on durable goods. We just hit, record. Well, actually, what happened with credit cards is balances actually dropped for the first time. Now, is that because of health or because of things just being the interest rates are so high, people are trying to reduce their debt burden? What's happening with the consumer?
So I'll start off with spending, right? We think about a proxy for overall consumer spending is retail sales, and not to say that's what we spend all of our money on, right? But it's a good portion of it, and it again proxies very well with how we spend. I would say you think about heading out of 2024, we were saying, I think we're going to be starting to hit a low, meaning things should start to improve. But again, we're coming off what we were saying was a low. Fast forward, we're a few months into this year now, halfway through the year really, and saying, okay, wow, we are actually year over year performing better, right? So you're starting to see that cyclicality, that momentum shift. I would say when I think about when I read in, different news articles and such, I'm reading about bankruptcies and all of these things. I go, yes, that's what happens at the bottom of the business cycle. We should expect that. But that doesn't mean that's actually what's going to be happening over the next 6 months to 1 year. So I would say,
I would say, I mean, let's pull on that thread a little bit. I mean, bankruptcies are up. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, they're more towards historic norms, but we are seeing bigger bankruptcies than we've seen for the last several years.
Yeah, I would say we're starting to see, I mean, if I think restaurants, for example, you're starting to see some big restaurant chains go through that. Yeah. I think this is what happens when you think about leverage, right? You're talking about a period of time where we were borrowing a lot during that pandemic period. It made sense. You had really low interest rates. Now, all of a sudden, you fast forward 5 years later, you need to re-up on debt.
Right.
That is a very different strategy when you're talking a significantly higher borrowing environment. So I think that as part to do with some of the bankruptcies, along with just maybe getting in front of our skis a little bit.
So, Pat, you agree?
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of times what we see with businesses is they plan linearly. And so at the end of the day, what they're doing is baking in past and prior expectations into the future. That is not really navigating the ebbs and flows of the economy. And so if you do get out in front of your skis, you've outpaced your growth. Now you have these businesses that are reacting, that they're out over their skis, to Jeremy's point. And so at the end of the day, that is what we most acknowledge towards the bottom of a business cycle, at that inflection point. And it's not to say at the bottom of the business cycle is when we start troughing and things are immediately getting better. It just means that they're getting less bad, because we think about things on the margins. How are things changing on a year over year basis? Are they getting bad and worse, or are they bad and getting a little bit better incrementally? And so that's where we see things taking that turn. And really the key is not planning linearly on what has happened, but planning for what is going to happen as we turn out, as we start heading into a bit more positivity. Again, we're not here to be like, oh, things are all rosy, things are amazing. We do a consumer report card where we look at all of the factors that drive consumer health. The consumer, we're giving them about a C right now. C's get degrees.
C's get degrees.
But at the end of the day, we aren't seeing this floor falling out from underneath us. I know there's a lot of pessimism. We're hearing about layoffs. We're seeing unemployment rates tick up, historically at a pretty low level, but unemployment rates are starting to tick up. And at the end of the day, it's definitely the margins that we're concerned with, and really the lead and lag relationship. What feels the economy first, what feels it right in the middle, and what feels it towards the end. Things like employment, bankruptcies tend to feel it towards the end of the cycle.
Well, can you walk me through? So we're talking about recession, we're talking about the consumer. I mean, what are other indicators you all typically look at to gauge the health of the economy and whether or not we've got a recession around the corner?
So I think, again, we think about what leads what we're feeling today is probably where we'll start with, because you sit and say unemployment, okay, but that doesn't lead where we're going. That's what happened. If anything, it's lagging because it's a response.
Usually it's lagging, right?
It's a response, right? So I would say you talked about it, corporate profits. Well, cash on hand generally leads the economy too, but focus on profitability, because I think that's an important mindset of, are companies profitable, and are they beginning to, rise in terms of that pool? And the answer is yes, right? Are bankruptcies real? Sure, but that doesn't mean the core economy isn't falling apart.
All right, throwing the challenge flag.
Challenge
out the gate. All right, we have a challenge flag.
All right, so the CEO survey just came out. And they are predicting that revenues are probably going to decline as we go through the course of the rest of the year. So tell me about that. That seems to be not consistent with the profitability growth that you're talking about.
So I think we should gear it more towards what's going on production first, and then that generally tells us, well, where is revenue going? I got to make widgets in order to sell widgets, right? So we can zoom in on that. You want to take a little bit of where we're at? Yeah.
So if we go through where we're at, we like to focus on something like industrial production, right? You need new orders to come in. You need production growing. We don't necessarily overarch with too much of a zoomed out view of, say, like gross domestic product. It's a bit too diversified. It gets a little bit muddy. But if we focus on just what is the U.S. producing, we have seen growth start to emerge within U.S. producer or U.S. industrial production. That growth has started at the beginning of this year, and we're seeing a lot of clear signals through the end of 2025 that year over year we will be in growth territory. And so as you're producing more, you should start seeing more revenues come into your business. And that's not to say some businesses are feeling weakness, some are not. These are aggregate viewpoints. And so if we poke out into the remainder of 2025, early 2026, we are getting those clear signals of upward momentum in what we are producing.
So is that reshoring? Is that existing manufacturers just producing more? Is it a combination of both? I mean, what is it?
Bit of both, right?
Okay.
And so at the end of the day, we talk about reshoring and onshoring in a very near-term lens of, are we bringing back trade? But at the end of the day, this has been a long-term pattern of concerted effort to try and bring more production back into the United States. And a big piece of that is, having the available resources.
Oh, I thought you were.
No, we haven't dropped the keyword yet.
We'll tee it up.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And so at the end of the day, when we think about trade, what we see is that, exports plus imports have been just growing over time, for almost all of time that we have recorded data.
U.S. grows, we get bigger and bigger, we trade more, right? Like that makes sense.
But at the end of the day, what we've seen for over a decade, going back to 2012, is that trade as a percent of overall production has been steadily decreasing over time. And we're getting all these signals of new companies reshoring in the past decade. And so this is starting to manifest itself. We have all this extra warehouse space that we've been building for the past several years, all this extra manufacturing capacity that we've been building over the past couple of years. And as we ebb and flow through business cycles, we're seeing now we have some more capacity to start growing again. And as we talk about the T word, do we drop it? Tariffs.
Tariffs are part of it, right? But
are they yet factoring in? Because I hate to say the other T word, but taco. But are we going to get tariffs? Are we not going to get tariffs?
Sure.
It's fluid. But I think in order for a manufacturer to really have faith that, hey, I'm going to make this investment in a plant, I'm going to reshore, I have to know that those tariffs are going to be in place for that period of time to recoup my investment. Right.
And this is where I was very explicit about saying the early part of 2026, the economy does not turn on a dime.
Yeah.
Right. It is a giant aircraft carrier. If you're going to move, it's going to be
like that
very,
better than
very
the
slow.
Titanic. So
Yeah, the aircraft carrier. It's a picture. And so to turn that, it's just going to be slow. And so as that business uncertainty kind of flows through and those new orders kind of maybe pull back a little bit and capital investments start pulling back a little bit, that's when we see some risk heading out into the latter part of 2026 of that manifestation of business uncertainty and unwillingness to go make those core capital investments or start expanding their capacity, growing the labor pool. And
so what about the negative GDP print in the first quarter?
Yeah.
Is that just a function of everything getting pulled into the fourth quarter of the previous year?
So and that goes right back to what we think is a better example, better representative of what we as an economy are doing, but most importantly, consumers, right? So we think of GDP, overall, consumption by consumers. You got government spending, you got investments, and then yes, the import-export relationship. Of course, in that paradigm or that calculus, really, as you increase imports, that's going to pull back down on your GDP. And so everyone's getting ahead and
ahead of the tariffs, right?
Sure. So then you have an immediate response at that point. So the first quarter comes in and we're negative. I remember GDP Now, the Atlanta Fed produces, and they came out a couple weeks before the first quarter came out, and they said, it's going to be negative, right? And the market kind of reacted. They were right. It went negative. You fast forward into their couple weeks later, right? You talk about, heading into May, for example, they immediately went, oh, it's going to be significantly more positive. So park that story for a second. Zoom in on consumption, right? That is what, 2/3 of GDP? That's 2/3 of the number that we're all looking at in the headline. It's going to be impacted by government spending and imports, exports. Sure. Park it for a minute. Zoom in on service spending, goods spending. Both are positive year over year. Both were positive quarter to quarter in the first quarter. Great. That tells us that the consumers continue to spend.
But how much is that? They have to spend, right? You have to get food, you have to get things. But when you look at things like durable goods, which is optional, that's down.
But you can dial back your spending year over year. And the answer was no. It actually was positive year over year.
Fair.
Right?
Yeah.
So that means we said, well, I've given you a year to maybe pull back on your consumption. And they didn't. And again, reminder, it's real GDP. Meaning we're removing the impact of inflation, which is slightly elevated already, right? So now, net, we're talking about more consumption.
Okay.
Again, coming in pretty rosy, so I do want to be that maybe the other-handed economist and say there is a lot of signs of weakness, a lot of uncertainty, especially when we peak beyond that early stages of 2026. So we're trying to get in front of it with our clients specifically, who are trying to navigate a bit trickier of an environment that doesn't have a clear vision in the second half.
So what is the advice for that uncertainty? Because that's typically when there's uncertainty, and we see it in our business that people are like, you know what, I'm not going to do anything.
Yep.
And sometimes that's a good answer. Oftentimes it's not. You're missing opportunities. I mean, what are you recommending?
And so there's kind of two key focuses that we have. One is how do you mitigate or how do you navigate some of that trade environment? I don't steal Jeremy's thunder on that piece because he loves talking about it, but I like to talk about diversification. What can you do to smooth out your own business cycles, try and find those key markets of opportunity? So, I mentioned GDP is this big number that kind of gets a bit conflated because there are so many pieces that factor into it. Well, can you make your business or make your entire team a bit more resilient to economic downturns or the business cycles? And so now is really the time for that due diligence. We've been seeing more due diligence being done because we think about whether it's the trade environment or the monetary policy environment not having a very clear picture into 2026. And so when we talk about that, it's like, well, gosh, diversification sounds so easy. What should we start focusing on? And you can look at business case analyses where you dive in and say, well, should I be making this capital purchase? What's the return on investment? Because we wouldn't come in and advocate for sticking your head in the sands and doing nothing, because the best way to erode your kind of financial bunker is to do nothing.
Right.
And so you need to have more scrutiny over your activities, whether it is an analysis on what is going on with my capital and my improvements there to help abate some of the labor challenges that we see out into the future, or are there new regions or territories that I should be trying to enter into, and what markets should I focus on and target there with a very refined analysis. And so when you think about just diving into a couple of those, like I said, due diligence activities, now's the time to really start doing them to get in front of the uncertainties that are still very present, that aren't necessarily going to impact today per se. It's going to impact 6 months from today.
Okay.
I'm going to have to do it. I have to do it.
Here comes the other flags. And for those that are just listening to this, I mean, we are throwing challenge flags onto the table. So go to YouTube if you want to see it live.
Yeah, I can't help to throw the challenge flag. And we do this on stage sometimes, and we'll just throw them at each other. No, I mean
he throws them at me. By the way,
you have it right. No,
take that personally.
Couldn't help just to interrupt you is really what it comes down to. But yes, the diversification piece is very important. And all he's saying there is what's happening now is return on investments become more of a problem because of generally you borrow to make investments in some way, shape, or form. Even if it's from your own coffers, you're taking it from something else you can spend with. That scrutiny is becoming a little bit more in depth. But at the end of the day, right, thinking ahead, and I would say, well, you have two options. I guess three. You can say, I'm not going to do anything because I have no idea. Or you're going to pull back because you think things are going to get worse. Or you say, I'm taking the chance because I think things are going to get better. What we're saying here is, no, we have more evidence to say things are going to get better. That is a very different executive mindset than, well, I think things are going to get worse. Mm-hmm. And you will miss out on opportunities if you right now are saying, I think things are going to get much worse. I don't see it, right?
But what if you are wrong? Does that come into the diversification and it's just kind of
sure? We can smooth out those mistakes. Absolutely. I mean, that's why the U.S. doesn't have these giant highs and lows, right? Yes, we have those black swan events, but generally we just hum along 1.5%, 3.5%. That's because we're so diversified as an economy, and so that's how we can smooth some of that out. Same concept. The diversification works.
Okay.
The tariff piece, though,
yeah, all right.
on I guess strategies, I can't help to bring it up. It's you're absolutely right in the sense. Listen, do we know what's going on? No, I mean they almost daily have been changing for the last few months, right? And we're all dealing with that. But there are definitely strategies that we should be thinking about, right? Some small ones. I don't even want to say necessarily small, but depending on where you're operating, there's bonded warehousing. Simply put, right, we're going to bring something in from overseas. I then owe a tariff on it. If I keep it almost like it's offshore, I don't have to pay the tariff right then. I can pay for it when I know I have the order coming in. Great, smooth some of that out. You still have to pay it, but help smooth out that cash flow a bit. But cost escalations, contracts. What are you doing with your contracts that allow you to adjust? Right now, that's very different depending on if you're on the buyer or seller side, right? But if I'm going to go into a contract and I'm buying from someone and I say, well, geez, inflation's been a bit, odd. I want to make sure that every year I have a cost escalation clause that says if inflation does beyond X, we go back to the table for a bit.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean the multi-year contract goes away. It just means we have to talk about price again.
Yeah, we renegotiate some piece of it.
Yeah,
and these are probably conversations that people didn't have for a decade, right?
Well, you always had them in just for what, like the pandemic stuff, right? The force majeure, right? But no, this is way more actionable, and we should be doing this as businesses more often than not.
We should have been.
Yes.
We probably just lost sight because nothing happened, right?
Yeah.
So we had so much stability for so long. It wasn't something we focused on.
Sure.
Attorneys probably threw some of that and we're like, yeah, whatever. Now we're having real conversations.
Now it's mitigate. Now it's way more of a strategy. Way more important.
Economics is cool, right?
Yeah.
Economics is cool now. We can talk about these fun things like inflation that just didn't seem like it existed during the 2010s. And that's exactly right, where we want to use it to your advantage as an executive. Try and get in front of things. Use the buy low opportunities to lock in a contract. Jeremy and I, we're forecasting a resumption of inflation. I think most economists are generally assuming that now. We've been talking about a resumption of inflation for years now because we see a lot of systemic things, whether we're talking about deficit spending or demographic changes or the wage and labor markets that are continue to put upward pressure on prices. And so we've had a little bit of a softening or a bit of softening in the inflationary pressures through the first half of this year. We see that inflecting into the remainder of 2025 into 2026, and we're just anticipating the back half of this decade to be more inflationary. So how do you get in front of it? How do you lock in at that low point and the proverbial buy low, sell high?
Well, and so that maybe ties into another question I have is like, where are we at in the interest rate cycle? Yeah. So obviously there's a lot of pressure from the executive branch, is historically unusual to lower rates. Chairman Powell has said that he's waiting to see what the impact is on inflation. That itself I find a little problematic because a tariff is a one-time bump. Right, very transitory, and we didn't change rates because we were transitory, right? So why wait for that? But I mean, tying into kind of some of the other concerns that you all just mentioned, maybe it makes sense to have higher rates, but yet, I mean, everyone is predicting that's off the table. Sure. That's the one thing that President Trump did. I mean, we are not talking about increases anymore. There's 3 governors are saying they're not in lockstep anymore. We're talking about a potential decrease. I mean, what are you seeing in terms of rates for the next year or two?
I think it's interesting because Patrick said, a lot of economists generally, like the consensus of economists is that inflation is going to be stickier, or the way I'd approach it is higher this second half of the decade or already. And that's not, to be quite honest, just an everyday economist. That's the Fed saying that too. Mm-hmm. What's happening is instead of them coming out point blank and saying, we think inflation is going to be higher than we expected. They're not really allowed to do it. They have to manage expectations. So what they do is they say, well, we'll push out the next quarter a little bit. It'll be a bit higher, and that 2% goal of ours will be another quarter out or another quarter out. This hasn't just been happening recently. This was happening well before tariffs. This was happening in the fall of 2024. To be honest, they miss quite often. We sometimes show what they say with the federal funds rate, which is obviously related to inflation, versus what happens to the federal funds rate. Now, keep in mind, this is a person that literally are people that have a lever to do that, and yet they're very much wrong. But I always try to smirk and say, it's not because they're wrong or doing malicious. They have a really tough job. One of those jobs is to manage expectations. If they told us right now, very loud, the way we're seeing the data, that inflation is going to be higher and that 2% goal is quite difficult to achieve, what do we all do? Well, then we all go, oh my gosh, right? I need to squirrel up right now, buy low, right? Because things are going to be higher. They can't do that, right? So they have to pull back. So again, this is not just a Patrick and Jeremy story. The Fed's telling us every time they meet and they release those projections, it's been changing for
and then they just reduce their inflation expectation. And then I see
Go ahead.
No, say basically what they've done is each quarter they'll release their forecast. So it's not after every FOMC meeting, but each quarter they'll release it. And so what they tend to do is they'll target long run. We're going to shoot for our 2% mandated target. That's kind of a soft mandate, but that's what they're shooting for in the long run. And so over time they will say, all right, what do we expect 2024, 2025, 2026 in the long run to be from an inflationary standpoint? And so what we've seen really since late 2023 through 2024 is each time they release that quarterly assumption, the rates are just tricking up on their inflationary forecast. And we're seeing that also true on their Fed funds neutral rate. Each time it's tricking up just a smidge, just enough to kind of like sneak it in there a little bit to show that they are anticipating higher levels of inflation.
And so, thus rates. That's where that neutral rate comes into place. They're saying, oh man, we have to increase that. Where we think net neutral for, it's not hurting the economy but not growing inflation is now higher than it was a year ago.
Well, so is this just Fed speak? Because and then they've said that monetary policy, they've acknowledged that it is restrictive, but we're saying that, okay, the neutral rate is creeping up.
Sure. I mean, I think they're doing it, I don't want to say on purpose, but that's what's been said. They want to slow down the steam of the economy. So, I mean, it should be restrictive to a point, right? That's the intent. I just don't think that the labor market has reacted nor will react to the way that monetary policy in the past maybe has impacted, which is partly why you see a level of inflation sticking around a little bit more than maybe what would have happened.
How does immigration play into inflation?
Boy, where do we start? Where do we start with that one?
Where are you going to go with it? Versus where I'm going to go.
Snickers bar.
There's a lot of lenses to shine on it. If we talk about the immigration profile, obviously there's spending that comes from immigration that should increase demand. Ultimately speaking, puts upward pressure on prices. The flip side, when we think about just labor force availability and the current paradigm that we're in with our labor supply, it's going to help kind of compress wages if we have heavy, robust immigration. And if we have the reverse, again, not to talk overly on politics or policies or anything, but if we have the reverse, that's going to kind of hollow out some of that demand, but it's also going to hollow out some of that labor supply. And Jeremy kind of pinpointed that the employment market is quite a bit different than what we've experienced for decades. We look at recorded data that goes back into the early 1900s, the 1940s, and at the end of the day, what we're seeing is that obviously demographics are changing, and that's a proxy of just headcounts, right? The baby boomers are entering into retirement, so now that availability, that labor supply is starting to constrict, and that's going to put upward pressure on wages. And if you don't have the headcount to replace that, that's going to put upward pressure on wages. And if you don't have the skills to kind of replace it, because we're talking about, if you think about the economy as kind of bucketed by those generations, you have the baby boomers, a very robust, large generation, and then just the headcounts, if you look at Generation X, it's quite a bit smaller. And so you don't...
But then we do have the millennials that are coming not too far behind, right?
Absolutely.
And they are bigger than the baby boomer.
But I don't have 40 years of experience, right? So there's a huge skills gap that is emerging because you have Generation X taking that kind of torch as the most experienced generation now, and it's just not big enough to replace the baby boomers that are exiting from a skills gap standpoint. And then Generation Z, like Gen X, is also quite small. So just from a headcount standpoint, you're not replacing the kind of well-deserved.
We do have a lot of younger people stepping into leadership roles probably way sooner than traditionally they would. I mean, when you look at politics, you've got young people running for office that you kind of look and you're like, okay, well, we got a 26-year-old. Like, what life experience do you have? But I mean, there's not this big group of people right now willing to kind of take that missing middle, right?
Missing middle. Yeah, Patrick always says sometimes if you think about the pyramid of it's age pyramid or population pyramid, is that what it is? And it's just, where different, generations are. And, right now we haven't really worked out our legs, right? We are pretty low there, right?
Skip the leg day,
chicken legs.
Yeah. I would argue maybe we didn't even go to the gym around the middle there either, but, we're starting to really work those shoulders out.
Millennials, they give us hips.
Yeah, they give us some hips. Yeah.
Bright side is we have other countries to take the lead from, see what's going on, and say Japan has been dealing with this for what feels like forever, but
then and China too.
Yeah, right? And China's been going through this for quite a bit. But if I want to move and pivot towards even some European countries, you look at Italy, for example, who's literally trying to incentivize people to kind of move in. And what they're basically saying is third generation. You're from you're living in the U.S., but if you can prove you're third generation from Well, great, we'll give you access.
I think
that's
they
huge.
give you a home for some like discounted. Yeah.
I think even somewhere in Ireland, they're doing something like pay $100,000 a year to go live on this island. Like, okay, that's a bit much. But
I said to my wife, I'm like, hey, you want to go to Italy or check it out?
Before we start making travel plans, I'm going to take these off the table so we don't have any more delay of game.
Don't
But
throw
also,
'em at
you both are on morning now.
Just don't throw them at you.
Yeah,
Okay.
you both are on morning.
Which country am I allowed to say?
You can say any of them, but
No, but we can look at what Canada's done. And what I think is interesting about Canada is their structural unemployment's higher than us, right? So you say, oh my gosh, they have more unemployment. They do a lot more immigration policies as well. That may insulate them better as you head out into the realm of the baby boomers not only retiring, but it sounds morbid, but jet setting somewhere else, right? Is the way I like to say it. Well, that immigration can insulate some of that downside pressure. So right now it hurts them. And this isn't new. It's been higher structural unemployment for a while. But again, think about long term. That might be a play that benefited them.
So before we get too far away from the interest rate conversation, I do want to talk about the Treasury market, long-term rates. So it was interesting. I mean, there was a lot of criticism about the previous administration and Yellenomics and only buying or only releasing bills and not any long-term financing. And maybe we missed an opportunity there. But now we've stepped in, and Bessent is pretty much employing the same kind of tactics. I mean, is that a way to manage the long-term rates and try to keep the long-term rates a little lower? What do you see happening in the bond market?
I've seen a couple things. One, I think the bond market's interesting the first half of this year because you actually had the world signaling to the U.S., hey, you're not exactly who you think you are in the borrowing world, i.e. you have a lot of volatility going on. This hurts you. This is not and us saying that to ourselves. This is actually the world, the open market saying that. So I think that's unfortunately upside pressure on rates that, by the way, the administration hasn't been able to get a hold of. That's actually why right after that Tuesday, I believe, that Tuesday auction that went almost no one showed up.
Yeah.
Rates went through the roof, and then all of a sudden we go magically, well, maybe we should pull back on tariffs, right? Maybe that was a coincidence, maybe it wasn't, but that was an interesting signal. It wasn't shortly after that all of a sudden you have a downward revision on what we would call in the world a risk-free rate. Well, if you've downward revised on multiple credit agencies, well, what's risk-free then, right? So I think that's interesting to keep an eye on what that's doing and why we're having this maybe elevated borrowing as a nation. But I think what another tool that I don't see talked about too often is stretching out our borrowing, meaning, all right, we're not going to do the 10 or 30-year treasuries. We're going to do 50-year treasuries. That may buy us the opportunity to push through some of this volatility that we're dealing with now.
How much of that are we doing in the market? I mean, to me, it seems like the majority of what's being released right now is all short term.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
yeah, I think kind of piggybacking off of some of that sentiment, like if you take into account what general expectations have been on the inflationary side, it's going to be a stickier interest rate environment. And that's whether it's a short-term, long-term, or mortgage rate. We're going into a pattern of just higher levels of borrowing. And so how does the Treasury, how does the Federal Reserve manage that? And that's where they're trying to almost compete with one another a little bit and trying to figure out, well, what's the correct path forward? Do we release a ton of money supply into the economy? Do we try and stretch out our yield curve? Do we try and try things, right? At the end of the day, going back to the point of, do we start seeing more creativity heading out into the place to try and stretch out the yields and try and kind of accommodate a higher level of inflation?
Not to mention you have I hate to bring it up because it felt like it got talked about for a year and a half or 2 years. The yield inverse, right? The yield curve.
Inverted yield curve.
Inverted yield curve. And it's like, okay, yes, that was a big thing. And everyone said, oh, well, it happened. We didn't go through a recession, and that means we can never look at it again. And I go, well, technically, we did have contraction in a lot of markets, right? You had it in the manufacturing side. You had it in durable goods year over year, so on and so forth. So you technically saw it, just not at the level that most people are used to when they think recession. They go, oh my gosh, that's the 2009, right? That's the pandemic period. It's like, well, there were things that struggled, and now we're coming out of it. But it is an interesting point at which you go, well, how do you get people to invest when the short term is still elevated to the point where that makes sense, right? I don't want to take risk into the future.
Right.
I'd rather just accept what I can get now. Especially when you're talking about, every couple months something changing, right? I kind of get it why it's more attractive on the
I'll
short
take a
term.
4% yield. Yeah, not bad. It's above inflation.
I'll take it. Yeah.
All right. What about the national deficit? So a lot of conversation about that. I mean, we just, I guess to date stamp this, I mean, we just had the big beautiful bill, which talks about adding to it, doesn't take into account tariffs. I guess the plan is to grow our way out. But I mean, are we in a death spiral? I mean, is the end coming?
So yeah, is the end. I think you mentioned earlier, like, are we in this big long-term economic cycle, 100-year cycle? I know there's a lot of contemporary economists talking about this. They've been talking about this for a bit, and the rising debt level, right? So deficit spending obviously adding to our aggregate debt, and we do see a lot of challenges that manifest as a result of that. But in the near term, you're talking about injecting the economy with more government spending, less taxes or tax credits, and that should have a near-term impact into 2026. But we think about the long term now, and what does this mean for, again, not to overbelay inflation, but you have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods if we're not producing any more with it. But then beyond that, when we talk about things like interest rates, the interest payment for this federal debt racing into $1 trillion territory, sounds like it's going to blow right past that. And what does that mean for our economy? Now you're not spending money for forward-looking production.
Right.
It's what previously happened. And so this is going to continue to manifest itself at the same time of those demographic challenges that we're going to be facing towards the end of this decade. And that's where you have that kind of turning point that a lot of folks are talking about. And we absolutely see a lot of challenge and risk that emerges because of that. I think not our analysis, but Hoover Institute put something out called the Ferguson Law. It's really a threshold where once you're overall,
like military spending or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's about how much your interest payments are as a percent of your defense spending. And once that eclipses 100%, what has been observed in history is that these great imperial powers are just, strong, mighty countries start to feel a lot of geopolitical challenges because now they can get challenged because their fiscal capacity is reduced and limited because they're spending so much money on servicing past debt. And now you run into the situation where you have, the late 1500s of the Habsburgs, or you talk about Napoleonic France, and doing a little history lesson. Let's fast forward to 2024.
Yeah.
No, U.S. just eclipsed that.
Russia, USSR.
Yeah, we have eclipsed that as the United States. And what does that mean for geopolitical challenges? And so you add that into the fold of, yes, we're not spending on forward-looking production. This threshold signals that there might be some more geopolitical challenges. You add demographics into it, and there's a lot of evidence for some weakness.
And you get the fourth turning.
And then many fourth turning.
I think
we don't have to get into that. But.
No, but I think that's what we've been saying, which is, yes, we see downside pressure, the next, call it 10 years or so. I think the difference is there's a lot of, really doom and gloom out there. And I think we're maybe a little bit more optimistic, right? And I don't know if that's the theme of today. I'm not really sure if that's the point there. But
if we could grow out of it, maybe AI and our productivity helps us, with a lot of that growth. And
what's interesting too, the debt as a percent of GDP is not. It's nominal dollars. So actually, in theory, if you have higher levels of inflation, you can actually kind of almost buy yourself out of it.
Inflate yourself.
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
Inflate the pain away.
So you have a little bit of tricky math going on there, but yes, I mean, it's by no means are we saying that the amount of spending here isn't going to either cause more inflation or potentially hurt us in the long run. Those things make sense, but yes, there are probably a lot of other benefits that we have out there. Technology is the way I'd say it. Maybe it's AI, but technology advancements and the way that we are adapting quicker can absolutely help us go through that, whether that just means people are living longer, so on and so forth.
I have a very basic economic question, but I'd love to know the statistics behind it or the research behind it. But so tax cuts. Do tax cuts result in additional job creation and spending and additional economic activity, or do those is that tax cuts go into people's pockets? I mean,
before you answer, because I know you want to, when Patrick turned 30, which I found out many years later, he didn't turn 30 that year. He turned 29, and I was just a bad friend, didn't remember your birthday. But I got him a signed autograph of Laffer, who made the Laffer curve, which talks exactly about this. At what point do you tax your way out of, or one point do you tax and lose, right, demand and you actually cripple the economy? So I got
where's that breaking point?
Yeah, yes, and I got him that signed thing. Now, in fairness, the Laffer curve has broke apart a bit over the years, but it's still, I think, an important piece.
And then you just talk about the ability to spend, right? It's even if it gets into pockets, you're talking about more wealth, you're talking about more disposable income, which generally tracks with more spending. And that's not to say there isn't a multiplier effect on those, tax cuts. Effectively, how much of the tax cut does trickle into the economy, and you have a lot of varying opinions.
Trickle down economics.
Yeah, it's a lot of varying opinions. Some say it's less than one, meaning that for $1 tax cut, you get less than $1 of activity in the economy. And then you have others that say, no, you get a 1.5 multiplier. It depends on,
So we don't know.
Yeah, it is very muddy.
I
Is
will
the
say,
answer.
that curve is literally broken down. I think the interesting thing maybe I'll lean on, though, is, boy, historically speaking, not to throw another economist name out there, but Keynes had an idea. And I'm not necessarily saying Keynes knew it all. But he did say, boy, if you're going to, I guess, give back to the economy to grow the economy during tough times, later on you have to do something, meaning reverse that. And so it is a challenge to hear, well, if we're going to give tax cuts to stimulate, economic well-being or economic growth, but you're spending even more later as a government, well, I mean, it actually helps GDP because, again, government spending is positive to GDP. But long term, and we just talked about that, the challenges of having a really high debt, interest payments that you are having struggled to pay in the future, those are bad. But we should have been right thinking about, if you're going to give back, you need to pull back from somewhere else.
Right.
To that point, like, again, even if you get less than $1 return on that tax cut investment, it's still new growth into the economy. So generally speaking, we see that near-term bump. Again, not to get overly theoretical, but we look at those models, you talk about demand, and it will increase demand in the short term. And then the balancing act that just hasn't happened with that school of thought is what kind of gets you into a debt position that we're in today.
Okay. Well, I mean, we're sitting here in Tampa Bay. So, I mean, what are the prospects kind of for 2025, 2026, the Tampa Bay economy? What challenges are you seeing? What opportunities are there here?
I think year over year, at least through first quarter, I believe, the U.S., again, year over year, is at about 2% GDP growth, right? But again, maybe that's not the measure we should be using, but that's the measure I'll throw out there. Tampa Bay and Florida specifically were both higher, right? And I'll speak to Florida. I believe it came in just slightly above, 2%. So generally speaking, the Florida market has, over the last few decades, been able to perform positively more than national. That's good. I'm living here for a reason. I'll take that. But also, you start drilling into other fundamentals. Unemployment rate better than the U.S., right? And that's a Tampa-specific measure. So if I'm going, well, what's impacting the macro has an impact on what we're dealing with. And I don't even say that this is the micro. It's still a very big economy. But it's going to be impacted by the same type of movement. So my outlook would be just as similar as what I'm thinking of the U.S., which is moderate growth through the end of this year. Probably from a GDP perspective, it might even come lower than it did perform the previous year. But growth is growth. And as we head into 2026, we should start seeing some momentum going on. Yes, there's a lot of noise, and we're definitely waiting on what to see what the Fed does, what tariffs do. But again, the core economic consumer looking pretty good. And that's also the same for Tampa.
I think he's been taking the positive route, so I've been trying to balance things out a little bit. Housing is something where we dabble in a little bit, and we think about just the affordability challenge. And you think about the existing supply that's in the Tampa Bay market, the vacancy rates, whether you're talking about housing vacancy, and the pace of change and the negativity that kind of has emerged. And this is simultaneously occurring when we think about non-residential construction, which really trails the housing market. So the housing market is trying to get those engines going while a lot of the kind of commercial construction is cooling off. And so simultaneously, you have these two effects of overall aggregate construction, feeling the affordability, feeling that interest rate environment, and that's been a bit cooler, and we see just a little bit more weakness heading into 2026 on that end.
Okay.
And unfortunately, if I'm going to be pessimistic, I'll say it. There's, I think, only about 10 or 11 states, last time I checked, that what I would say don't have an affordability challenge for homes, meaning their income is
this is not a
sufficient
local
enough.
phenomenon.
Yeah,
It's
that's-
in most of the country.
Florida's on the upper end of unaffordable, right? So that's an issue, and we know what happened to our asset prices over the last couple of years is part of it, but mainly the issue is mortgage rates. Those would have to come down enough to make a material impact in the state of Florida, which I wouldn't expect them to necessarily, based off what the Fed is doing, right? That can change on what happens with treasuries, and then ultimately what happens with banks.
Yeah, Jeremy's been calling the Fed. They're not picking up the phone. He wants those mortgage rates to fall. He has a condo to sell. So
yeah, I've been begging them, and I usually don't talk about them around tax season. Like now we're beyond that, so I get to talk about them again.
Well, I'd say, I hope they answer your call because, I will tell you, the residential market, when we got rates down, we've been for the last 3 years somewhere between like 6 and 8%. When we got down to like just under 6, the mortgage applications went through the roof. It becomes tremendously more affordable, as well as the issues that we've gotten in some commercial real estate, some multifamily, some office. And then you look at banks, bond portfolios and the other comprehensive losses. That would be a big help. So, we can just get a little bit of relief. So, lob a call into Jay and say what he says.
Keep texting. I don't know what number I'm texting, but they haven't responded back. So I'll keep you posted.
All right. Kind of key takeaways, wrap it up. Summarize it for us. I'm hearing positive, negative, optimistic, pessimistic. Where are we at? What do you think? And maybe just practical advice for like a business owner.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm going to say, so long term, we are probably a bit more bullish than what we would hear from a normal economist. I think it's very easy to come in and be pessimistic. I took the easy job today because if I'm wrong, everyone's happy because things are good. And if I'm right, I can say, oh, gosh, I was right. But long term, we do see a lot of reasons for positivity. We focus on productivity as a core driver of economic growth. And we think about really an inflection point that has started to emerge and data that we look at, not to nerd out too much. I have both the flags, so you can't throw them at me. So factor productivity, total factor productivity is one of those core measurements that we look at for a production function. And we've seen the past couple of years, factor productivity has actually been outperforming what we experienced in the 2010s. And we think about a lot of the innovations that are coming down are now much more production based, right? If you think about an airplane, during the 2010s, we got seat back TVs. And that was amazing for when we travel, but there's nothing productive about that. But then if you start talking about, well, gosh, what would sonic travel do for trains and the planes and the ability to travel much faster, speed is found, which is an emerging technology. It started to emerge in the 2000s. We couldn't figure out the noise pollution, but they're solving that. What now happens when planes can travel?
We had the Concorde, right?
We had the Concorde, yeah.
But it was just too expensive. Yeah. So what is changing to make that?
So ultimately what we've seen is the ability through innovation has allowed to produce at a lower cost and less noise pollution. That was the big thing, is the noise pollution. But going beyond that, we can talk about just the vast innovations and investments into the energy sector, whether we're talking about renewables or nuclear. Nuclear's had a huge bit of a renaissance that it really kind of was about to have in the 70s, and then a lot of negative press with nuclear occurred, and now we're seeing it occur. And so when you put a lot of this innovation into the energy space, that trickles through the economy as well. And then we talk about AI, which I think is the buzzy one. So we acknowledge it, but I think it's getting plenty of press at the moment. And then getting into robotics and biotech, I think is the big one.
The big one, because we're talking about an aging demographic.
Right.
If you can allow them to live, and again, we're talking about the margins. Even an extra few years gets us through an even tougher time.
Yeah, right. Maybe we don't need that population growth. They can work longer, be more productive. Right?
And to be honest, that generation. Another reason why I would say we're more insulated than I think. Some of the doom and gloom out there is, boy, the largest transformation of wealth in human history is going to take place during that time. Now, unfortunately, a lot of it's based in certain assets that may all be sold kind of, at the same time.
Boomer's going to sell those homes, right?
But it's not, it's not even those homes, right? It's all the other assets that folks have, but even equities. But the fact is, it's an enormous amount of wealth that folks are going to be able to insulate themselves through a downward pressure that may be, okay, the government can't get us out because, again, each dollar is now less worthy, I guess, when we go through that. Well, great, I have money from somewhere else. So that's I think important. But if I zoomed in on the short term, we've ticked boxes on that today. I think there's enough evidence for us to say, as an executive, if you're generally correlated with the macroeconomy, which many are, right? Park the construction side, the residential side for a bit. But if we think about the core economy and you think about retail, you think about manufacturing, we are much more closer to the bottom than we are from the top. And so everyone's saying, oh my God, things are going to start getting worse. And we're saying, no, there's fundamentally a lot more to be seen just on the way we've historically been through. Again, production went negative last year into early this year. Great. Didn't go that negative, which it normally does, but it went slightly negative. It's time for that rebound. That's inevitably what will happen. A drop in rates only positively impacts that outlook.
Well, guys, people want to get in touch with you. How would you recommend they do that?
Jeremy's great on nights and weekends. We'll give you his cell phone number. No, just kidding. We have emails that we are happy to provide. It's patrick.luce@stantec.com.
Jeremy.bess@stantec.com.
Keep it simple.
Oh, nice and easy, man. This was a lot of fun, guys. I think a lot of great information. I'm glad nobody got hit in the face with a flag. So
I didn't spill the water, and yeah, that was a win.
It's a success. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
Appreciate it. Thank you all.
You can find Money Market and the Bank of Tampa online, as well as on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and Instagram. Before you leave, make sure you hit that like, follow, or subscribe button, and we'll be sure to see you around in the Money Market.